Imagine this. It's the middle of the night. A cold wind moves across the sea. Somewhere on the coast of medieval England, a village sleeps in silence. No warning, no army, no sign that history is about to change. Then, from the darkness, ships appear, long, narrow, moving like shadows across black water. Men step onto the shore, carrying axes, swords, fire. By sunrise, everything is gone. Homes burned, families slaughtered, churches emptied, and survivors left with only one terrifying story. The Northmen came. For nearly 300 years, the mere sight of a ship on the horizon was enough to send entire kingdoms into panic. Kings feared them, priests prayed against them, villages abandoned coastlines because of them. History remembers them as monsters, brutal warriors, savage invaders, men who lived only for violence. But what if that version of the story isn't completely true? Because the real Vikings were far more complicated and far more dangerous than most people realize. This is the brutal truth about Vikings. The myth of the Viking. Say the word Viking, and most people picture the same thing. Giant warriors, massive beards, horned helmets, covered in blood, charging into battle like wild animals. It's an image Hollywood has repeated for decades. Movies, TV shows, video games. The Vikings became symbols of chaos, brutality, destruction. But almost immediately, there's a problem. Because one of the most famous things people associate with Vikings never actually existed. Those horned helmets? Completely fake. Historians have found Viking helmets, real ones, made for war, and none of them looked anything like the fantasy image we know today. No horns, no dramatic spikes, because in real combat, horns would have been dangerous, easy to grab, easy to break, easy to get killed. The truth is, the horned Viking image likely appeared centuries later, created by artists and costume designers who wanted Vikings to look more dramatic. In other words, one of the most famous symbols of Viking history was fiction. But if Hollywood got that wrong, what else did they misunderstand? The truth is, Vikings were never just warriors. In fact, most Vikings weren't warriors at all. They were farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen, fathers, mothers, entire communities trying to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Because long before Europe feared them, the Vikings were simply people trying to survive. Their home was Scandinavia, a brutal land of mountains, freezing winters, rocky coastlines, and farmland too unforgiving for easy survival. Life there was hard, really hard. Winters lasted forever. Food was never guaranteed. One bad season could mean starvation. And when survival becomes uncertain, people change. They adapt. They become harder, stronger, more willing to take risks. And slowly, something dangerous began to emerge from the north. Because the Vikings weren't born conquerors, they became conquerors. The question is, what transformed ordinary people into the most feared force in medieval Europe? The answer begins with survival. The land that created the Vikings. To understand the Vikings, you first have to understand the world they came from. because no civilization becomes feared by accident. Violence, ambition, survival. These things are shaped by the land itself. And the Vikings came from a land that showed no mercy. Far to the north of Europe, beyond forests, mountains, and frozen seas, lay Scandinavia, a region we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Beautiful, but unforgiving. Winters could feel endless. Snow buried the land for months. Temperatures dropped low enough to kill. Crops failed easily. Food was uncertain, and survival depended on preparation. One mistake, one bad harvest, one brutal winter could destroy an entire family. This was not a world built for comfort. Contrary to popular belief, most Vikings weren't born into greatness. They were born into struggle. Many lived on isolated farms, small wooden homes standing against brutal winds. Families worked together simply to survive. Men hunted, farmed, built boats. Women managed households, food supplies, and trade. Children learned quickly because childhood didn't last long. Life was demanding, and survival required everyone to contribute. But there was a problem. Scandinavia had limited farmland, too many people, not enough resources. Land became harder to inherit. Wealth became harder to find. Opportunity began disappearing. And eventually, survival alone wasn't enough. People wanted more land, more wealth, more power, which raised a dangerous question. If your homeland cannot provide, where do you go? For most civilizations, distance was a wall. Oceans separated people, protected kingdoms, limited ambition. But the Vikings saw something different. They saw opportunity. Because while Europe built roads, the Vikings mastered the sea. Their weapon wasn't just the sword, it was the ship. Long, fast, flexible. Viking longships were engineering masterpieces, designed to survive violent oceans while remaining light enough to travel rivers. They could move through deep water or appear suddenly where no enemy expected them. Entire armies could emerge from places thought impossible, and once they arrived, escape became nearly impossible. Villages had no warning systems, no standing armies, no defenses. By the time people saw the ships, it was already too late. But here's where history becomes complicated. Vikings did not leave Scandinavia simply because they loved violence. That story is too simple. The truth is more human. Some searched for wealth, silver, gold, resources. Others searched for land, better futures. Some were merchants, trading across Europe and beyond. Others were explorers, driven by curiosity. And yes, some came for war. Because when wealth is easy to take, violence becomes profitable. And medieval Europe was vulnerable. Rich monasteries stood nearly defenseless. Coastal villages had little protection. Kingdoms fought each other constantly. To the Vikings, Europe looked weak, divided, exposed, like a door left unlocked. And then, in the year 793, something happened that changed Europe forever. A quiet island monastery on the coast of England would become the first warning, a warning the world almost ignored. Because what arrived from the sea that morning wasn't just a raid, it was the beginning of an age of fear. June. The year is 793. On the northeast coast of England sits a small island monastery called Lindisfarne. Quiet, isolated, sacred. To the people of medieval Europe, places like this felt untouchable. Monks spent their days in prayer, preserving books, caring for the poor, living lives of silence and devotion. War felt far away. The sea felt peaceful. But that morning, something appeared on the horizon. Ships, strange ships, long, narrow, moving faster than expected. At first, perhaps nobody panicked. Traders, maybe. Travelers. Fishermen. But then, men stepped on the shore, armed, fast, ruthless, and within moments, chaos began. The attackers moved quickly. Buildings were looted, sacred treasures stolen, monks beaten or killed. Some were dragged away into slavery. Others never escaped. Blood stained holy ground. And for the people who survived, the attack felt impossible to understand. Because monasteries weren't supposed to be targets. Churches were sacred, protected, or at least they were supposed to be. But the Vikings didn't care about Europe's rules. They cared about opportunity. And monasteries had something valuable: gold, silver, wealth, little protection, easy access from the sea. To the Vikings, places like Lindisfarne looked vulnerable, easy, profitable, and terrifyingly defenseless. News traveled slowly in the Middle Ages, but fear moved quickly. Stories spread from village to village, church to church, kingdom to kingdom. Men from the north, warriors arriving without warning, striking fast, disappearing back into the sea. Entire coastlines began living differently. People watched the horizon. Villages feared the sound of waves. Prayers changed. One famous prayer reportedly asked, "Deliver us, O Lord, from the fury of the Northmen." Because nobody knew where the Vikings would strike next. One day England, another day Ireland, then France, then somewhere else entirely. They didn't follow predictable rules. They arrived suddenly and vanished just as quickly, which made them feel unstoppable. And this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because yes, the Vikings could be incredibly brutal. Raids often ended in death, villages burned, people enslaved, wealth taken by force. Violence was not unusual, it was often expected. Strength mattered, reputation mattered, fear mattered. In Viking culture, weakness could be dangerous. Honor meant survival, and survival often came through force. But brutality alone does not explain their success. Because many civilizations in history were violent, yet few inspired fear the way the Vikings did. So what made them different? The answer may have had less to do with weapons and more to do with belief. Because Vikings didn't just fight differently, they thought differently. Imagine believing that dying in battle was not something to fear, but something to welcome, a glorious path to eternity. To understand the Vikings, you have to understand what they believed happened after death. What made the Vikings fearless? To most people in medieval Europe, death was the end of everything. Something to fear, something to avoid, something unknown. But for the Vikings, death was not the end. It was a doorway. In the Viking world, honor in battle meant everything, and dying in battle was considered the highest honor of all. Because, according to their beliefs, warriors who died bravely were taken to a great hall, a place of feasting, strength, eternal preparation for a final battle at the end of time. This belief created something powerful, something dangerous. A mindset where fear of death was replaced by acceptance and sometimes even desire. Because if death leads to glory, then fear loses its control. And a warrior without fear is unpredictable, relentless, hard to stop. Imagine facing an enemy who does not fear dying, who sees battle not as risk, but purpose. That is what many European kingdoms encountered. Soldiers who advanced without hesitation, raiders who struck fast and retreated before full resistance could form, fighters who valued reputation over survival. But again, this was not pure chaos. The Vikings were not mindless. They were strategic, adaptable, observant. They learned from every raid, improved their ships, expanded their routes, built trade networks alongside warfare. Because, while Europe saw only destruction, the Vikings saw opportunity. It is easy to define the Vikings by their violence, but that would be incomplete. Because the same people who raided monasteries also built farms, traded across continents, explored unknown seas, and established settlements far beyond Scandinavia. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of North America long before most of the world realized it. They were not only destroyers, they were also explorers, builders of routes that connected worlds, bridges between distant lands. But history always changes. The same forces that created the Vikings eventually changed them. Kingdoms in Europe grew stronger, coastal defenses improved, trade replaced raids, Christianity spread across Scandinavia itself, and slowly the age of Viking raids faded. Not with a single battle, not with one defeat, but with transformation. The world became harder for Vikings to raid and easier for them to integrate. The age of fear became the age of nations. The brutal truth about the Vikings is that they were never just monsters and never just heroes. They were shaped by survival, driven by opportunity, defined by a world that offered them little and demanded everything. To their enemies, they were a nightmare from the sea. But to history, they became something else entirely. A reminder that civilization is not always built in peace. Sometimes it is shaped in fire.